Chapter 8, the famous chapter 8, I'm getting near the end now, is the second last chapter, and it is the one that has caused most controversy and unsettled many people. It's certainly the one that most of the media attention has been given to, and within chapter 8, the question of the divorced and the remarried and access to the sacraments has been at the highlight of many people's thinking. One of the problems of this is that sometimes if people were even to pick it up, they would ignore chapters 1 to 7, go straight to chapter 8, go down to the footnote that causes so much concern to so many people, and think that that's all the document's about. And so the richness of this teaching of Pope Francis on marriage and family can easily get lost. And it's up to us, I think, to make sure that that doesn't happen. For that reason, I didn't want to spend too much time on chapter 8 because I would just be falling into the same trap that everybody else has fallen into, but I want to say just a few words about it. Firstly, the title of chapter 8 is important. Accompanying, discerning and integrating weakness. The priests who are here, but not just the priests, anybody who has a bit of a pastoral heart about them will know that this is very much what the church is all about. Accompanying, discerning and integrating weakness. You could make out an argument that the whole of Jesus' life and ministry was about accompanying, discerning and integrating weakness. First and foremost with his 12 apostles. It seems to me that this chapter at its heart is challenging us to do what I just spoke about a moment ago, and that is to find a way, and it's not easy, to find a way of holding together the high ideals of our faith, which we must never compromise on, and the reality that so many of our people and so many of us struggle to reach those high ideals. This is undoubtedly true of marriage and family life. Those of you who are married and parents in a family will understand that much better than I would. But I'd like to suggest that it is probably true of pretty well every aspect of the life of everybody here in the room. Trying to hold together the ideals to which we're called and the reality that we're not there yet, and we might have a long way to go to get there, is the constant challenge of the Christian life. Who of us here tonight, for example, can say of ourselves that in any area of our lives we have no room for further development or improvement or conversion? Anyone want to put up their hand? No. Who of us would be brave enough to say that we knew another person's situation so well and so intimately that we could form an absolute and infallible judgment about that person's standing with God? Who would dare to say, I know exactly how that person stands before God? I wouldn't be going to do it. I'm not even sure how I would stand before God. How can I know how anybody else stands before God? These are important questions that the Pope he's not asking those specific questions, but that's what lies behind what he's doing. I'm reminded in this context of the Lord's advice that his disciples would need to take the plank out of their own eye before they tried to remove the speck that was in someone else's eye. Or of the invitation of Jesus to those gathered in the temple forecourt when he was speaking to the woman who'd been caught in adultery, suggesting that the one who didn't have any sin, him or herself, could throw the first stone. And of course, as we know, everybody walked away because nobody was without blame or sin. Pope Francis expresses it in this way. The Church, and by that he means all of us, must hold up the call to perfection and ask for a fuller response to God, while at the same time accompanying with attention and care the weakest of her children. The question is, how do you do it? But that's what he's calling us to. The church must hold up the call to perfection and ask for a fuller response to God, while at the same time accompanying with attention and care the weakest of her children. As I was trying to say a little earlier, I'm convinced that Pope Francis is calling the church back to an approach of mercy, which he discerns, and many people would agree with him, has been obscured in the life of the church for too long. In chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis is calling the church to find a better way of assisting its members who are struggling, for a whole host of reasons, to live the fullness of the Christian ideal. To find a better way. To accept that at the moment we haven't yet found, I would say, a way that's working very well to accompany people who are struggling. How can we find a better way? It's a question. I don't have a final answer, but I think the question is really important to ask. How can we as a church find a better way to walk with people who are struggling in whatever area, whether it's marriage and family or any other area? How can we find a way to walk with people and help them to take steps towards a fuller response to God's call? Pope Francis is not suggesting, and he could not suggest, that the church abandon its ideals or change its doctrinal teachings. He said often enough that he is a loyal son of the church and he believes what the church believes. Nor, I think, is he suggesting that it is objectively impossible for people to live up to the call or the demands of the Gospels. Now, I say objectively, deliberately. God will always offer the grace for those who need it. However, the grace that God offers will come to us in the reality of our broken lives. And it's within the reality of our broken lives that we will struggle to respond to the grace that God is offering. What I think the Pope is saying, that it may be subjectively, because of the brokenness of a particular situation, it may be subjectively very difficult for a person at any given time to fully respond to what God is asking of them. And this has long been the traditional teaching of the Church in moral theology. Many of you would be very well aware of the classic distinction between the objective nature of a situation or action and the level of subjective responsibility. And Pope Francis is, I think, inviting us just to ask these kinds of questions. He doesn't give the answers himself. But the difference between an objective situation and the level of subjective responsibility. An extreme example, but a not uncommon one, of course, would be the question of an abortion, which is always and everywhere and in every circumstance objectively evil. A human life is always destroyed, and that can never be a good thing. But the level of subjective responsibility for a particular woman who may choose to have an abortion, or people who may choose to support her and encourage her in that decision, the level of subjective responsibility can be diminished for a whole host of reasons. If the person concerned has never really heard or understood or been able to grasp what the church teaches in this area, they may even believe that this is a good thing to do and the right thing to do and the necessary thing to do in a particular set of circumstances. Nothing can alter the objective evil. A life is destroyed. But the person may not be subjectively responsible or completely subjectively responsible because she or he hasn't been able to grasp what we perhaps all see so clearly. So one of the questions, and this is the challenging bit, one of the questions implicitly suggested by Amoris Laetitia, and it's a question, is to what extent the principle of diminished subjective responsibility can be applied to what the Church has traditionally called irregular situations. To what extent can that principle, which operates in other areas, be applied to this area, if at all? That's the question. And a variety of answers to that question have been given and continue to be given. And that's confusing and it's unsettling for many people. But I think we simply have to accept that this is a question that's being asked and being grappled with, and as yet a final definitive answer hasn't been offered. It may take a while for things to be resolved. We may have to live with a certain uncertainty and ambiguity about this. At the moment, the Church's practical position is very clear. Those who are in what we call an irregular situation, so those living together without being married, those living in a second marriage while the first marriage hasn't been annulled, those living in a de facto relationship, those living in a same-sex relationship, all of those kinds of things. The Church's position at the moment is those people should not approach Holy Communion because their objective living situation is not in harmony with the Church's teaching. And of course, one of the essential things about the Church's teaching is that the Eucharist and Eucharistic communion is a sign of communion in the faith. And if you're in an objective situation which is not in harmony with the faith, that's the difficulty. So the practical position of the Church is clear. It's not dissimilar, it's not the same, but it's not dissimilar to the logic that applies to not permitting people who aren't Catholics to receive Holy Communion. Because the principle is that receiving communion is a sign of our communion in the faith, and if you're not in the communion of the faith, either because you belong to a different faith or you're living objectively in a situation which is in conflict with the faith, then there's a conflict of sign. So that's the official position. The Church's judgment at the moment, and it is a disciplinary judgment, but one which derives from theological considerations, is that those in irregular situations shouldn't receive Holy Communion. I think Pope Francis is simply asking theologians to investigate whether or not the disciplinary provisions are the logical and inevitable result of the theological considerations. The theological considerations are clear. What the Eucharist is and what it is a sign of, and what approaching the Eucharist signifies for us, communion in the faith. So the Pope is simply saying, is the discipline that people shouldn't go to communion if they're in a regular situation, always and in all situations, an inevitable consequence of those theological considerations? Some people are suggesting that it may not be, other people are saying that it is. It was certainly the conclusion that Pope John Paul II reached in Familiaris Consortio, where he spoke about the need, certainly for couples who are living in an irregular marriage situation, to live as brother and sister. There's no final agreement as to whether in this disciplinary matter there is room for further theological development, which could admit of some situations where John Paul's position can be modified. I don't have the answer to that. I think we're living in a time where the theologians, following the guidance of the Pope, are going to investigate it further, and we don't know what the outcome will be. It might help, perhaps, if I shifted out of the very controversial area of marriage and family and receiving Holy Communion to a slightly different area, but to help you understand. There was a controversy which arose during the time of Pope Pius XII in relation to his encyclical Humanae Generis. This encyclical, which was promulgated in 1950, was directed at addressing what Pope Pius called I'm quoting, some false opinions threatening to undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine. At a certain stage in that encyclical, Pope Pius addresses the question of polygenism. That is, the theory that all human beings do not descend from a common ancestor, namely the first man, Adam, but from multiple ancestors, and that in the Bible, the word Adam should be understood not as a single human being, but as that group of the original human beings from which every other human being has since originated. So that was the question that was in the air, and he was trying to address it. He was very clear in his own mind that Catholics should not embrace polygenism, but he expressed it with a certain caution. And this is what he said. It is in no way apparent how such an opinion could be reconciled with that which the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the teaching authority of the Church propose with regard to original sin. In other words, what he's saying is, according to our understanding of original sin and our understanding of the Scriptures, and particularly the book of Genesis, it's not apparent how our doctrinal teachings can be harmonised with polygenism. But implicit in saying it's not apparent is that one day it might be. And so we need to keep an open mind. He didn't say it is impossible, he said it's not apparent. I can't see how it can work. It's basically what he's saying. Such a phraseology leaves open the possibility, just the possibility, not the certainty, just the possibility, that one day it might become clearer how something like polygenism, some form of that understanding, might be compatible with the Church's teachings on original sin. And in fact, of course, it's more about the doctrine of original sin than it is about who Adam was. I don't want to discuss that question tonight. I wanted to just raise it as a different kind of example of the principle. Could it be that Pope Francis might be adopting the same kind of cautious approach? So I'm paraphrasing Pope Pius and putting words in the lips of Pope Francis, both of which might be perfectly illegitimate things for me to do, but nevertheless. Could it be that Pope Francis is saying it may not be presently apparent how the Church's discipline in relation to the reception of communion might be changed without undermining or contradicting the Church's doctrinal teaching on the indissolubility of marriage, but perhaps further prayer, reflection and theological study might clarify this for us. He's asking the theologians to look at this matter. In these final remarks on what is a controversial chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, I've actually focused on only one very narrow part of that particular chapter, really on the single aspect of whether or not divorced and civilly remarried Catholics might be permitted under some circumstances to receive communion at Mass. It's a much more complex issue than I've presented here. I've just wanted to open it up for you. I've done this because it has generated so much discussion and even dissension in some parts of the Church. But I wanted to finish by going back to where we started. It would be a significant mistake if we were to come to Amoris Laetitia in a way which does not situate the document in the context of Pope Francis's urgent call to the Church to reflect more fully the quality of God's mercy. It's right and proper to consider some of the specific questions which the document, and in particular chapter 8, raise in our minds. But if it means that in doing that we avoid the urgent call to return to the mercy of God as a fundamental characteristic of everything we're on about as a church, then I think we run the risk of being deserving of the condemnation that Jesus pronounced against some of the religious leaders of his own day. You experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with heavy burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift a finger to help them.